Welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be showing you how to adjust the settings on your camera to make your videos look as good as possible for YouTube. Now, this is very important if you just got your camera, and let's just say you're not Peter McKinnon yet, which honestly, most of us are not. So if that's a situation for you, definitely stick around. I'll talk about the different settings you need to know, and right here I have a Nikon. I'll actually be showing you on a Canon camera, but this works for any other camera out there. So even if it's a phone camera with some pro settings on there, or if it's a mirrorless, a DSLR, whatever your camera is, I'm going to show you how to adjust the settings or what settings you want to have so you can shoot the best videos possible. Now, a quick disclaimer, in this video I will be showing you the best settings for a studio setup like this where I have soft boxes and a gray background and I'm not really moving around, but I'll also tell you later on how you can apply these to maybe an outdoor sort of motion type video or any other video you might be taking. So if this is your first time on this channel and you haven't yet subscribed, but you're looking to grow your YouTube channel or your social influence on any other platform, whether that's Facebook, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever it is, consider going down and starting your growth now by clicking the subscribe button to this channel. My brother and I are putting out videos every single week to help you grow your influence on the internet. So first I want to talk a little bit about the theory behind this before I get into the settings, and this is going to help you understand in different situations how to adjust these different settings to make your videos look as good as possible. So in a video, of course, you have a whole bunch of pictures, 30 pictures per second, 60 pictures per second, whatever your frame rate is, that's going to be a bunch of pictures smashed together to make your video. Now, each picture, you need it to be properly exposed. Now, in photography, they have what is called the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle, each point is a different setting on your camera, and these three settings make up essentially what is controlling the brightness of your image. So the first of the 3 points I want to talk about is shutter speed, and this is very easy to understand because the way your camera works is for each frame, as I said, it's taking a picture and it opens and closes a shutter to let a certain amount of light in. Now, if you have a very slow shutter, so let's say 30, that means 1/30th of a second is the amount of time that your aperture is open and then the shutter closes, and that's how much light gets let in and recorded by your sensor. Now, if you move all the way up to like 500 or 1000, that means 1/1000th of a second is the time that it's open. As you can imagine, because that's so much quicker, there's a lot less light that gets let in and your images are going to be darker. So you really need a much brighter surrounding in order to use that. But the benefit of that is actually that you're not going to have any blurring. So for 1/30th of a second, if something's moving very fast, when the shutter opens, it's here. When it closes, it's there. You're going to have blurring between that individual frame. Now, the second point I want to talk about is the aperture, which is essentially how big the hole is that the light is allowed to come in through the lens into your camera. Now, this is a little bit counterintuitive because the smaller numbers are actually a bigger aperture size because it's actually a fraction. So you have 1/1.8 would be a very, very wide aperture, which means a lot of light comes in, which also means that your depth of field is very narrow. So if you're taking a video of me right now, maybe my nose would be out of focus and then my eyes would be in focus and everything behind me would be very, very, very out of focus. So you have a very blurry background. But if you have two people in a frame and maybe they're a little farther apart from each other, you really need to make sure that you have the aperture adjusted a little bit smaller so that they're both in the depth of field, they're both in focus. Now, the third one is a little bit more confusing, and this is the ISO, which is essentially going to be the sensitivity or the gain of your sensor. And the reason that this is a little weird is because it sort of is carried over from film, where the ISO would be something about the film. But right now, just think of it as the gain or the sensitivity on your sensor. So essentially what you're doing is you're saying if it's really, really dark out, you take whatever signals that your sensor is receiving and you amplify them. And as with any amplification, sometimes there's a little bit more noise in there. And by noise, I'll show you an image right now of what a noisy and a not noisy picture is, where you see sort of the grains in there that is not quite accurate. So the sensor is picking up something and it amplified it a little bit incorrectly, and it wasn't actually what was supposed to be there. So that's what is known as noise. The ISO, of course, the lower number you get with bright light situations, generally the better things are going to look. You're amplifying things less, but when you're in darker situations, you sometimes have to move it up a bit more. Okay, so here we have my SL2, and I'm just going to show you the settings on this camera. Now, the very first thing you want to do is right now I'm shooting in automatic. You want to go over to manual. You always want to shoot in manual so you can control the settings as much as possible to really optimize what your camera is seeing and recording, so you can change all the settings for any different light situation. So because we're in a studio, right now it's already set up pretty well, but the first thing you want to do when you're setting this is you want to go into right here is your shutter speed. Now, the shutter speed, because it's a touchscreen, it's going to look a little different than some of the other cameras maybe. quality, but the shutter speed, you want to make sure it's at least double whatever your frame rate is. So right now I'm shooting 30 frames per second, and that means I could technically have each frame as 1/30th of a second, and it would be one continuous, the shutter would really almost never be closed, honestly. So that's why you want to make sure you're shooting at least double that. So if you're shooting 60 frames per second, make sure you have the shutter speed as 1/120th of a second. Here I'm doing 30 frames per second, so I'm going to make it 60. Now the next thing you want to do to optimize your settings is go and change your aperture. So right here, because I have a lot of light coming in, I can close my aperture a little bit and it'll still work, but I typically like having the aperture as open as possible so it focuses on me and really blurs the background. So you don't see any wrinkles in the background, you don't see any small imperfections in there, and overall it's going to look pretty good. So I always open that as much as possible. If you're using maybe a larger lens like a 50mm and you can go all the way down to like 1.8, you might not want to push it that much, because sometimes what happens is you get a little bit of vignetting where you see like the black up in the corners. Because this is a decent lens and it's really not showing a whole lot of vignetting, and even if it does, I don't really care that much on this scene right here, I'm going to open it all the way up to 2.8. Now, the last thing you want to do is change the ISO. Now, the ISO, if it was too dark in here, this would be the last thing you'd bring up. And you really, depending on the camera, you really don't want to bring it above like 400 or 800 if you have a good camera. If you have a cheaper one, you probably don't want to bring it above 200 before it starts to look a little bit grainy. Of course, the best you're going to get is when you're going down to 100. So I always leave it down at 100 and I have as much light as possible. And that's how we're going to have a properly exposed image. So right here, we have a proper exposure for when I'm sitting there. You're going to have the gray background, you're going to have the white table, and then I will be properly exposed and properly lit. I can always move my lights around if the shadows look a little weird, but essentially that's what you're going to do when you want to have it lit as well as possible. Now, the next thing you want to do after you have the proper exposure is actually go into the menu. Now, every camera is going to have this in a different place, but if we go on a Canon camera, for example, you go to menu, you go to the camera, little camera image right there, and for me, it's in tab number 3. You can go and change the white balance. Now, what you want to do for white balance is you want to make sure it's a custom white balance for most situations. Sometimes you could use a standard one, so let's just show you in a standard one, for example. If I just hit the little Q button right there, I can change my white balance and say, maybe it's really cloudy. If I want to say cloudy, it's going to be a little more orange and yellow, and maybe my skin tone will look a little darker, but the background won't quite look gray. It'll look a little bit more like a brownish color. So maybe I want to say it's maybe shady instead, and that's going to be a slightly different. So you can see that's even, warmer, or you can go to like tungsten light, which is going to be very blue. So obviously, none of these are perfect. If I'm really lazy, sometimes I'll just go to cloudy, and it looks good enough. But if you really want to have it look as good as possible, go into menu and go into custom white balance. Now, your custom white balance, what you have to do is you have to take a picture first. So I took a picture of a plain white piece of paper in front of my lights, and actually by putting it in front of my lights and taking the picture, then I go into menu and I change the custom white balance to this most recent picture. You say set, and it'll set it as that. And then later, when you're actually in your, so let's just go right back here. When you're actually in your settings here, you can go over to custom white balance, and it'll be perfectly balanced based on the lighting you have. So it's going to match the temperature of whatever light bulbs you have. Now, some other cameras, you can control it, individually to exactly the right temperature. This typically works very well for me. Okay, so if you're shooting a video outside and there's a lot of motion or someone who's moving around or any kind of sport, you want to first make sure that you're capturing it without having blurry frames. And in order to do that, you need to change your shutter speed. So we can go right here and say, you're watching some kind of sport, maybe it's a very fast moving sport, maybe it's very bright out. Maybe you can move that up to 500 or 1000 with no problem at all. But if it's a little darker out and you have to move it up, you want to make sure you don't keep it down because you don't want the blurry frames. But once you move it up, you'll see that everything becomes very dark all of a sudden. So then you're going to have to keep your exposure proper by changing your ISO until it looks, approximately as bright as you need it to be. So right there, I'm going up to 800 by using a 1/500th of a second as my shutter speed. It's not ideal, but you might have a little bit of grain, but if you're doing something with a lot of movement or action, it's going to make sense that you have to do this. Depending on what your setup actually looks like, you might not be able to optimize all of these settings at the same time. So 3 things that I recommend getting in ascending order of cost. The first one is going to be better lighting. So if you're using lights specifically with different colors, if you have one that's kind of bluish and one's kind of yellowish, I recommend not doing that. Now, some of the professionals might do that for different purposes, but when you're starting off, I recommend using lights of the same color. Maybe get some studio lights. I'll link them down below if you want. They're only like $50, and it's going to make your picture look a lot better. So you can do your white balance more accurately, and you can also have more light on you, so you can optimize the settings a little better. If you can't afford that, you can always go near a window, although that might compromise your audio quality. The second thing I recommend you get is actually a better lens for your camera. So if you're using the kit lens still, you might want to consider going out and spending maybe about $100 to get a better lens that has a larger aperture. So right here, a 24mm lens with an f2.8 lets in significantly more light than you would have with a kit lens. Now, if that's still not enough for you, you can go out and buy a 50mm lens. Your camera's going to be quite a bit farther away, but you let in quite a bit more light. This is also a great photography lens. I would recommend anyone buys this. Again, I'll link it down below. It's about $100 to $130, depending on where you're looking. The third thing I recommend you get is actually a better camera body. Now, I don't recommend this if you're just getting started off, but once you start to get going, if you're shooting in darker spaces, maybe in a cave or whatever, if you shoot in like a whiskey cellar or something like that, you might want to consider getting a better body for your camera that actually has, a full frame sensor, for example, and also can manage ISO better. So if you have a more expensive camera, typically there's less noise and you're able to go to a much higher ISO before the picture starts to look bad. So guys, that's what I have for you in this video. Please let me know if there are any other settings you like to adjust when you're taking your videos, or if you have any other questions, let me know down in the comments below. I'll be trying to answer as many questions as possible. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.